This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
The dawn broke over Pearl Harbor with a gentleness that betrayed nothing of what was to come. I remember standing on the deck of the USS Arizona, my coffee growing cold in my hands as I watched the sun paint the Hawaiian sky in shades of amber and rose. The water was so still that morning, like glass stretched across the harbor, reflecting our mighty battleships in perfect symmetry. I was 22 years old, fresh-faced and full of dreams about returning home to Nebraska, where my girl Sarah waited with letters that smelled of lavender and promises of a future we'd build together. The other sailors were still asleep in their bunks below deck, and I cherished these quiet moments before the day's duties began, when the world felt peaceful and the war in Europe seemed like something happening on another planet entirely. The salt air, mixed with the scent of oil and metal, a smell I'd grown accustomed to during my months stationed here in paradise. Pearl Harbor had become a strange kind of home, where palm trees swayed against a backdrop of gray warships, where the warmth of the tropical sun contrasted with the cold steel of naval machinery. I thought about my mother's last letter, where she'd written about the apple harvest back home and how my younger brother had taken over my chores at the farm. She'd asked me when I'd be coming home, and I'd written back with optimism, telling her it wouldn't be long now, that tensions would ease and I'd be back for Christmas. How naive those words seemed now, written by a boy who didn't yet understand that history was about to place him at the center of a moment that would change everything. My friend Jackson emerged from below deck, rubbing sleep from his eyes and complaining about the early hour. We'd become close during our service together, sharing stories of our hometowns, our families, our dreams for after the war that we didn't think would ever touch us here. He talked about opening a garage in Detroit, working with his hands on engines instead of battleship maintenance. We made plans the way young men do, believing we had all the time in the world to see them through. The morning felt ordinary, blessed with a kind of mundane routine that makes you forget you're a soldier at all. We were just boys in uniform, counting down the days until we could return to the lives we'd left behind. The harbor was crowded with vessels that morning, battleships lined up in neat rows like toy boats in a bathtub. The USS Arizona, our home, sat proudly among them, her crew of over 1,500 men sleeping, eating, preparing for another Sunday in paradise. Some of the guys were planning to attend church services, others to play baseball on the field near the base. Sunday was supposed to be a day of rest, a day when even war took a pause to let men remember their humanity. I watched a small boat cut across the water, leaving a white trail in its wake, and marveled at how peaceful everything seemed. The calm before the storm, they call it, though none of us knew a storm was coming. I finished my coffee and crushed the cup in my hand, tossing it in the waste bin before heading to my post. The morning light was growing stronger now, burning away the last traces of dawn's softness and replacing it with the harsh clarity of day. I thought about writing another letter to Sarah, telling her about the beautiful sunrise, about how the ocean looked like liquid gold in the early morning. I wanted to capture this moment of peace, to preserve it somehow, because something deep in my gut told me to remember this feeling of safety, this illusion of invincibility. Looking back now, I realized that was the last moment of innocence I would ever know, the final breath before the world exploded into chaos and I learned what it truly meant to be a soldier. The sound came first, a distant droning that at first seemed like it could be anything. Mechanical failure, training exercises, the rumble of engines from the airfield. But then the drone grew louder, multiplying, filling the air with a mechanical symphony that didn't belong to any Sunday morning. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun, and saw them, dozens of aircraft approaching in formation, their silhouettes cutting across the blue sky like dark omens. For a split second, my mind tried to make sense of it, to rationalize what I was seeing into something benign, something expected. Maybe it was a drill. Maybe someone forgot to inform us about training exercises. But then I saw the markings on the wings, the rising sun symbol painted in red, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. The first explosion shattered the morning calm like a hammer through glass. I watched in disbelief as the USS Helena erupted in flames, the sound of the blast reaching me a heartbeat later, so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. The peaceful harbor transformed into hell in the span of seconds, smoke and fire rising from multiple ships simultaneously as bombs fell from the sky with terrifying precision. Men poured out onto the decks in various states of undress, confusion written across their faces, some still thinking this had to be some kind of mistake, some terrible accident. The alarm bells began ringing across the harbor, their urgent clanging mixing with the screams of men and the thunder of explosions, creating a symphony of chaos that would echo in my nightmares for decades to come. Jackson grabbed my arm, his face pale with shock, his mouth moving but no words coming out. We stood frozen for a moment that stretched into eternity, watching as our world disintegrated around us. Torpedoes sliced through the water like hungry sharks, their trails visible in the clear harbor water before they found their marks and sent geysers of water and metal high into the air. The Japanese planes swooped low, their machine guns chattering, bullets pinging off the deck around us like deadly rain. I saw men fall, saw blood mixing with seawater, saw the impossible becoming real with each passing second. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here, not to us. We were supposed to be safe in our American fortress in the Pacific, protected by our mighty fleet and our distance from the war. The USS Arizona shuddered beneath my feet, and I knew we'd been hit. The impact threw me against the rail, the metal hot against my skin, even through my uniform. Fire bloomed from somewhere below deck, orange and hungry, consuming everything in its path. The heat was instantaneous and overwhelming, a wave of furnace air that made it difficult to breathe. I heard someone shouting orders, heard the chaos of men trying to respond to an attack that had caught us completely unprepared. Our anti-aircraft guns began firing back, the sound adding another layer to the cacophony. But it felt futile, like throwing stones at a hurricane. The Japanese planes kept coming in waves, relentless, methodical, executing a plan that had clearly been rehearsed to perfection while we'd slept peacefully, dreaming of home. Then came the big one, the bomb that would seal the fate of the USS Arizona and most of her crew. The explosion was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, a sound so massive it seemed to swallow all other sounds, a force so powerful it lifted me off my feet and sent me tumbling across the deck. The ship's forward magazine had been hit, and the resulting detonation ripped through the vessel like the wrath of God himself. I watched in horror as the front of our ship lifted into the air, metal twisting and groaning, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the sky. Men were thrown into the water, their bodies ragdolls in the face of such overwhelming destruction. I scrambled to my feet, my ears ringing so loudly I couldn't hear anything else, my vision blurred by smoke and tears and the sheer impossibility of what I was witnessing. This was the end of everything, the moment when the old world died and a new, terrible one was born. The USS Arizona was dying, and she was taking her crew with her. The ship listed heavily, the deck tilting at an angle that made it nearly impossible to maintain footing as oil-fed fires raged across every surface. The smoke was thick and black, choking, filling my lungs with toxic fumes that made each breath a battle. I could hear men screaming, some calling for help, others calling for their mothers, their wives, their gods. The heat was unbearable, like being locked in an oven, the metal beneath my hands blistering hot, the air itself seeming to burn as I breathed it. I needed to get off the ship, but the path to safety was blocked by walls of flame, by twisted metal, by the bodies of men who'd been my friends just minutes ago. Jackson found me in the chaos, blood streaming down his face from a gash across his forehead. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the starboard side, where men were jumping into the water below, desperate to escape the burning ship. But the harbor water was covered in fuel oil, a thick layer of flammable liquid that had leaked from ruptured tanks across the fleet. The oil was on fire, creating a nightmarish scenario where men jumped from burning ships only to land in burning water. I watched in horror as sailors splashed down and immediately began thrashing, their clothes igniting, their screams cutting through even the din of battle. The choice was impossible: stay on the ship and burn, or jump into the water and burn. Death was waiting either way, patient and hungry. We helped pull men from below deck, their faces blackened by smoke, their eyes wide with terror. Some were wounded, shrapnel embedded in their flesh, blood soaking through their uniforms. We formed a human chain, passing injured sailors, hand over hand toward whatever escape routes remained, though fewer existed with each passing moment. The ship groaned beneath us, the sound of metal tearing, of a great vessel dying. Water rushed into the lower decks, mixing with oil and fire to create steam that scalded anyone caught in its path. I saw men trapped behind walls of flame, reaching out, begging for help I couldn't give them. The guilt of leaving them behind, of choosing survival over heroism, is a weight I've carried ever since. An officer appeared through the smoke, his uniform in tatters, shouting orders to abandon ship. The words felt surreal, impossible. This was the USS Arizona, one of the most powerful battleships in the American fleet, and we were abandoning her less than 15 minutes after the attack began. But there was no other choice. The ship was settling lower in the water, listing further with each second, and soon she would take anyone still aboard down with her to the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Jackson and I looked at each other, a moment of understanding passing between us without words. We'd survived this far. We had to keep going. We moved toward the edge of the deck, looking down at the horror below, at the burning water that was somehow our best chance at survival. I jumped, the fall seeming to last forever, time stretching as I plummeted toward the inferno below. I hit the water hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs, and immediately felt the oil coating my skin, thick and slick. The water was warm, heated by the fires raging across its surface. I swam underwater as long as my burning lungs would allow, trying to put distance between myself and the ship before surfacing. When I finally came up for air, gasping and choking, I was surrounded by debris and bodies, by burning oil and sinking ships. Jackson surfaced nearby, and together we swam toward the shore, kicking through the nightmare, dodging flaming patches of water, pulling other survivors along with us when we could. The Japanese planes still circled overhead, their machine guns still firing, but they seemed almost distant now, secondary to the immediate struggle to simply stay alive for one more breath, one more stroke, one more moment. The distance to shore couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards, but it felt like miles. Every stroke was agony, my muscles burning from exertion and fear, my lungs struggling to process the smoke-filled air. The oil made swimming difficult, creating drag getting to my eyes and mouth, the taste of it mixing with salt water and blood. Around me, the harbor was a vision of apocalypse. Ships sinking or burning, some doing both simultaneously. Men struggling in the water, calling out for help, for salvation, for their lives. I tried to help when I could, grabbing onto sailors who were too injured or exhausted to swim on their own. But there were so many, too many, and I was just one man with limited strength and a desperate need to survive. A young sailor couldn't have been more than 19, grabbed onto my arm with the strength of pure panic. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and he kept pushing me under in his desperation to stay afloat. Jackson helped me pry him off, and together we got him turned onto his back, towing him between us as we continued toward shore. The kid was mumbling prayers or pleas or memories. I couldn't tell which. His uniform was torn, exposing burns across his chest and arms, the skin red and blistering. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that we'd get him to safety, to a doctor. But the words stuck in my throat because I didn't know if any of it was true. For all I knew, the Japanese were already landing troops. And we'd swim to shore only to find capture or death waiting there instead of rescue. The explosions continued behind us, each one sending shock waves through the water, the pressure waves hitting us like invisible fists. I looked back once and immediately wished I hadn't. The USS Arizona was gone, settled on the bottom of the harbor, only her superstructure visible above the water, fire still consuming what remained above the waterline. Over 1,000 men had been aboard her that morning. Most of them were still there, trapped in the hold, drowned or burned, or both. The thought made my strokes more desperate, made me kick harder, because I couldn't end up like them. Couldn't let that steel coffin be my grave. I had promises to keep, letters to write, a life to live back home in Nebraska, where none of this insanity could touch me. My feet finally touched bottom, and I nearly wept with relief. Jackson and I dragged the young sailor into the shallow water, then onto the shore, where other survivors were gathering. Medical personnel were already there, overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded, working frantically to treat injuries that ranged from minor cuts to devastating burns and traumatic wounds. I collapsed onto the sand, every part of my body screaming in pain and exhaustion. The oil covered me from head to toe, mixing with blood from cuts I didn't remember receiving. I looked down at my hands and they were shaking so badly I could barely control them. Shock was setting in, the adrenaline that had carried me this far beginning to fade, leaving behind the raw reality of what had just happened. But there was no time to rest. Even as I lay there trying to catch my breath, the Japanese planes continued their assault. Bombs fell on the airfields, on the docks, on any target that represented American military might in the Pacific. The second wave of attackers arrived, fresh and deadly, continuing the work the first wave had started. I forced myself to stand, to help pull more survivors from the water, to assist the medics with the wounded. The battle was still raging, and even though I'd escaped the burning ship, I was still very much in the middle of a war zone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to find shelter, to hide until it was over. But I couldn't. There were still men in the water, still sailors who needed help. And despite everything, despite the horror and the fear and the overwhelming desire to simply surrender to the trauma, I was still a soldier. So I waded back into the water, back toward the smoke and fire and death, because that's what you do when the world is ending. You help whoever you can, and you pray it's enough. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but those hours contained a lifetime of horror. When the Japanese planes finally withdrew, disappearing into the sky as suddenly as they'd appeared, the silence that followed was almost more disturbing than the chaos had been. Pearl Harbor burned, thick columns of black smoke rising into the blue sky, creating a pall that blocked out the sun and turned day into an apocalyptic twilight. The water was choked with debris, with oil slicks still burning. with the bodies of sailors who hadn't made it to shore. Ships that had been proud symbols of American naval power were now twisted wrecks. Some capsized, others sunk, a few still burning with fires that would rage for days. I walked among the wounded, my body moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what had happened. Men lay on the ground in rows, some moaning in pain, others eerily quiet, their eyes staring at nothing. Medics worked frantically, triaging injuries, making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of burning oil, scorched metal, burned flesh, and death. It was a smell that would never leave me, that would wake me from sleep decades later, as fresh and terrible as it was in that moment. I found Jackson sitting against a palm tree, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. We didn't speak. There were no words adequate for what we'd witnessed. But I sat beside him, and our shared silence said everything that needed saying. The count of the dead and wounded grew as the day wore on. Over 2,000 Americans had been killed in the attack, more than 1,000 of them aboard the USS Arizona alone. The wounded numbered in the thousands more, many of them with injuries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Ships that represented years of construction and millions of dollars in resources were destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise so complete that we'd barely managed to fight back, our defenses caught entirely unprepared for an attack we never believed would come. The myth of American invincibility had been shattered in a single morning, and in its place was the cold reality that we were vulnerable, that war had found us, regardless of how much ocean we put between ourselves and the conflicts in Europe and Asia. As night fell, the fires still burned across the harbor, illuminating the destruction with an orangey glow that made everything look even more hellish. I finally found a moment to sit down, to let the exhaustion wash over me, and that's when the full weight of what had happened hit me. I'd survived when so many others hadn't. Men I'd eaten breakfast with that morning were dead, trapped in sunken ships or burned beyond recognition. The life I'd imagined, the peaceful return home to Sarah, Nebraska, suddenly seemed impossibly distant, replaced by a future that would be defined by war and violence. I thought about Sarah's letters, about my mother's hope that I'd be home for Christmas. And I realized that boy who'd written those optimistic letters was dead, killed somewhere between the first explosion and the desperate swim to shore. I pulled out my wallet, its contents soaked with oil and seawater, and carefully extracted the photo of Sarah I kept tucked inside. Her face was barely visible beneath the damage, but I could still see her smile, still remember the day that photo was taken at the county fair. I made a promise to her then, to that image, and to the real woman waiting for me thousands of miles away. I promised I would survive this war, that I would come home to her, that the Japanese had taken much from us that day, but they wouldn't take my future. It was a promise I wasn't sure I could keep, but it was something to hold on to, a reason to keep fighting when everything inside me wanted to give up. The world had changed, and I had changed with it. Transformed from a boy playing at soldier into a man who had looked death in the face and somehow lived to tell the tale. In the days that followed the attack, Pearl Harbor became a massive recovery operation. We searched through wreckage, pulled bodies from the water, worked around the clock to salvage what could be saved and honor what was lost. The USS Arizona remained on the bottom of the harbor, a tomb for the men still trapped inside her hull. Divers reported hearing sounds from within the wreck in those first days. The tapping of men still alive but unreachable, trapped in air pockets with no hope of rescue. We stood on the shore and listened to those desperate signals grow weaker and eventually stop, each of us carrying the guilt of our survival, wondering why we'd been spared when they hadn't. The randomness of death in war is perhaps its cruelest aspect. the arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies, separated by nothing more than chance and a few feet of distance. I finally managed to write to Sarah, though it took me 3 attempts before I could find words that wouldn't terrify her. I couldn't tell her the truth. Could describe the burning men or the ships sinking with their crews still aboard, or the way the harbor water had been so thick with oil and blood that you could barely see through it. The census wouldn't have allowed such details anyway, but beyond that, I couldn't bear to share that darkness with her. Instead, I wrote about how I was safe, how I'd survived the attack with only minor injuries, how she should unworry because I was strong and would make it through this war and come home to her. Every word felt like a lie, not because the facts were wrong, but because they failed to convey the fundamental change that had occurred inside me. The man writing that letter was the same man who left Nebraska full of naive patriotism and dreams of adventure. The war had come to America, and America responded with fury. The day after the attack, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date that would live in infamy, and Congress declared war on Japan with only 1 dissenting vote. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on us, and suddenly we were fully engaged in the global conflict we'd tried so hard to avoid. Young men across the country rushed to recruiting stations, eager to avenge Pearl Harbor to make the Japanese pay for their treachery. I watched newsreel footage of the enthusiasm back home and felt a disconnect between their righteous anger and my own hollow exhaustion. They were angry. I was tired. They wanted revenge. I just wanted to stop seeing burning men every time I closed my eyes. My new assignment came through after 2 weeks. The Navy was desperate for experienced sailors, and those of us who'd survived Pearl Harbor were considered veterans. Now, our trial by fire making us valuable assets in the long war ahead. I was assigned to a destroyer, a smaller vessel, but one that would see action across the Pacific as we began the long campaign to push back against Japanese expansion. Jackson got the same assignment, and we took comfort in the fact that we'd face the coming battles together. The night before we shipped out, we sat on the dock at Pearl Harbor, looking out at the harbor that still showed scars from the attack, and made a pact. We'd watch each other's backs, we'd survive this war together, and we'd make it home to tell the story of what happened here, to bear witness for the men who couldn't. I took one last look at the wreck of the USS Arizona before we left, her rusted superstructure jutting from the water like a gravestone. Oil still leaked from her hull, creating a rainbow sheen on the surface that caught the sunlight. Somewhere down there, entombed in steel and water, were the remains of over 1,000 sailors, men whose war had ended before it really began. I saluted them, a gesture that felt inadequate but necessary, an acknowledgement of their sacrifice and my debt to their memory. The war was just beginning for me, but for them, it was already over. I promised myself I would remember them, all of them, and that their deaths would mean something. That promise would carry me through the dark years ahead, through battles and loss, and the constant presence of death until finally, years later, I could return home and try to rebuild a life from the ashes of who I used to be. 70 years have passed since that December morning, and I'm an old man now, my body worn by age and the accumulated weight of memories. I sit on my porch in Nebraska, the same farmhouse I grew up in, watching the sun rise just like I watched it rise over Pearl Harbor that last peaceful morning. Sarah is gone now, taken by cancer 5 years ago, but we had a good life together, raised 3 children, saw grandchildren and great-grandchildren come into the world. I kept my promise to her. I survived the war and came home, though the man who returned was different from the boy who left. She never complained about the nightmares that woke me screaming, about the way sudden loud noises would send me diving for cover, about the drinking I did to quiet the memories. She loved me anyway. Loved me through the broken parts that war had created. I've outlived most of the men I served with. Jackson died in the Battle of Midway, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his destroyer taking a torpedo that sent her to the bottom in minutes. I received word of his death while stationed in the Solomon Islands, and I mourned him alone, unable to even attend a funeral because there was no body to bury, just another name added to the long list of sailors lost at sea. I kept our pact, though, survived the war, and came home to tell the story, to bear witness for both of us. Over the years, I've attended dozens of funerals for my old shipmates, watched the generation that fought that war slowly disappear, taking their stories with them. Sometimes I feel like a ghost myself, a remnant from a time that younger generations can only understand through history books and fading photographs. The USS Arizona still sits on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, now a memorial and a grave. I returned there once, 10 years after the war ended, and stood on the white memorial structure built above her sunken hull. Oil still leaked from her tanks, drops floating to the surface like tears, and people called them the tears of the Arizona, weeping for her lost crew. I stood there and read the names on the memorial wall, over 1,000 of them, men I'd known, men I'd served alongside, men who died while I survived. The guilt of survival never really goes away. You just learn to live with it, to carry it like a weight you'll never be able to set down. Why did I survive when they didn't? The question has haunted me for 7 decades, and I'm no closer to an answer now than I was then. My children and grandchildren sometimes ask me about the war, about Pearl Harbor, wanting to hear the stories firsthand before it's too late. I try to tell them, try to find words that can bridge the gap between their peaceful world and the hell I lived through. But it's difficult. How do you explain the smell of burning flesh to someone who has never experienced anything worse than a kitchen fire? How do you describe the sound of men drowning inside a capsized ship to people who they never heard anything more disturbing than a scary movie? The truth is, you can't. Not really. The experience of war is something that can only be truly understood by those who've lived it. And maybe that's a blessing for those who haven't. I wouldn't wish those memories on my worst enemy, let alone the people I love most in this world. But I keep telling these stories anyway, because someone has to. The men who died at Pearl Harbor deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or names on a memorial wall, but as the living, breathing human beings they were. They had dreams and families and futures that were stolen from them in a single morning of violence. My friend Jackson wanted to open a garage in Detroit. A kid named Tommy from Texas was engaged to be married the following spring. A sailor from California named Martinez played guitar and wanted to be a musician after the war. These stories matter. These lives matter. And as long as I'm alive to tell them, they won't be forgotten. That's the burden and the privilege of survival, to carry the memories of the dead and ensure that their sacrifices meant something. When I'm gone, when the last of us who were there that day has passed away, Pearl Harbor will become just another chapter in history books. But until then, I'll keep talking, keep remembering, keep honoring the men who gave everything on a Sunday morning in December when the world changed forever. The story of Pearl Harbor isn't just about a military defeat or a historical turning point. It's about ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, about courage and sacrifice and the terrible cost of war. As fewer survivors remain to tell their stories firsthand, it becomes crucial that we listen, that we remember, and that we pass these lessons on to future generations. Visit Pearl Harbor if you can. Stand on the memorial above the USS Arizona and read the names on the wall. Understand that each name represents a complete human life, full of hopes and dreams that ended too soon. Support veterans organizations that help those still bearing the physical and emotional scars of service. Talk to the veterans in your community while you still can, and truly listen to what they have to say. Their stories are our history, our heritage, and our responsibility to preserve. Never forget that freedom isn't free. It is purchased with the blood and sacrifice of generations of Americans who stood up when their country needed them. Honor their memory by being the kind of citizen worth their sacrifice, by building a country worthy of their legacy. Share this story, pass it on to your children and grandchildren, and ensure that December 7th, 1941 truly remains a date that lives in infamy, a reminder of both the worst and the best of what humanity is capable of when pushed to the brink. Es